Yeah, hi, I'm Sverre Raffnsøe. I'm Professor of Philosophy of Copenhagen Business School and Institute of Advanced Study Fellow at the Collegium de Lyon, affiliated with the École Urbaine de Lyon and the École Anthropocène de Lyon. And a warm welcome to you, Marta Gasparin and Daniel Nyberg. I'm most grateful that you kindly agreed to take part in this take part in this series of talks on the Anthropocene. And the theme for this specific discussion is business and value creation in the Anthropocene, organization and organizing in the Anthropocene. And Daniel Nyberg is professor of Newcastle Business School, Management and Organizational Studies in Australia, down under. A native Swede, you've traveled all over the world and you've been employed in the Netherlands, in UK, in Sweden and Australia. So you're kind of a cosmopolite. Maybe you will also draw on this kind of experience. Though you made numerous contributions to the subject at hand today, I'd like to highlight two. Together with Christopher Wright, the University of Sydney, you published a monograph entitled Climate Change, Capitalism and Corporations, Processes of Creative Self-Destruction with Cambridge University Press in 2016. And together with Christopher Wright, also you equally edited a special issue of the journal, the important journal organization entitled Organizing in the Anthropocene. And we'll probably also touch upon some of these publications and other publications by you. When we just scheduled this talk a couple of months ago, you, Marta Gasparin, were Associate Professor in Innovation and Design Management at Leicester Business School. Here you were principal investigator of a research process on slow design-driven innovation. We'll probably also talk about that today, funded by the UK Economic and Social Research Council. In Leicester, you were also founding member of the Anthropocene Research Group, together with Professors Jan Salsiewicz and Mark Williams, who have also taken part in this talk previously. In the meantime, however, you've become appointed Associate Professor at Copenhagen Business School. Congratulations with that. And presently you're organizing a conference at the British Academy on the theme An Aesthetic Inquiry of the Anthropocene. Might also become part of the discussion. You also published the article, The Business School in the Anthropocene, Parasite Logic and Pataphysical Reasoning for a Working Earth, published with the Academy of Management, Learning and Education in 2020, quite recently. This is also an article I think that we might want to discuss. Now, as in the previous discussions, we've met to invite the listeners into the much discussed Anthropocene, a new possible geological epoch in which we may already have arrived. You can like it or not, you can know it or not. It's a new epoch that possibly follows and replaces the 11,700-year-old Holocene, our most recent epoch. But it's also an age that, according to some, distinguishes itself from all previous eons in the 4.5 billion years long history of the Earth, since it's the epoch in which the impact of collective human activity has acquired paramount importance, and in which human activity decisively affects geological sedimentation. Whereas the Holocene, the most recent geological epoch hitherto, during which the human species proliferated and spread worldwide, seems to have been the climatically most stable period in the history of the Earth. So far, the Anthropocene is characterized by a new accentuated instability and unpredictability. And you all both also touched upon that. As global warming makes it graphic, human significant effects the home planet of human beings so drastically that not only heat and drought, but also high water may come. The development has already gone too far. It's no longer to go back and pick up and start all over again. As a consequence of human influence, the ground on which humankind has stood is quaking, and the sky may also risk to be falling on our heads. It's quite, So beginning to congratulate themselves with finally being allotted the principal part of the central stage of the local scene, the human actors suddenly seem to become affected and become troubled as they discover that somebody is drawing the curtain to reveal a much larger and more complicated scenery, which we're going to discuss today, the effects on. Here they realize that they must share the action with the scenography, since the various elements of what they used to consider as the environment of their performance begins to play an active part. no longer to be perceived as an indulgent and stable framework for human activity, life and nature on Earth has increasingly begun to appear as a large, irritable, and easily excited physical being, susceptible of reacting and responding vehemently, maybe even of erupting in violent outbursts at times. While the human species has taken on colossal size, the world has equally also taken on overarching proportions, unsurveyable proportions, which is also of importance for organizing, I believe. In the introduction to the previously mentioned special issue of organization, you, Daniel, stress this as you write: human civilization has now altered basic Earth systems. 2 centuries of industrialization and economic globalization based on rapacious exploitation of fossil fuels and the destruction of forests, lands, oceans, and cultures have disrupted the Earth's atmospheres and ice caps and devastated the biosphere. This occurred at such a rate and pace that Earth scientists argue that we are leaving the Holocene geological epoch and entering the more volatile Anthropocene. This is the period in which human activity has discernibly affected the Earth's global functioning to such an extent that it is now operating outside the range of any previous natural variability. And then you continue, these changes breach planetary boundaries and reduce or eliminate the safe operating space for humanity. Quite important, I believe, including a step change in the average temperature of the planet this century of around 40 degrees Celsius. Life this century for much of the planet's population is like to be increasingly hard, violent, and precarious, almost sort of a Hobbesian vocabulary you're using. The implications for organizing could not be more profound. Could you describe this change that arises with the Anthropocene more fully and flesh out what are the implications for organizing organization?
Yes, and thank you both for the introduction, but also for setting the tone of the discussion today. And I quite like the metaphor of the curtains, where we discover, oh, this is much complex than we thought. We're not in control.
Taken aback at the very same time.
It's sort of, oh wait, what just happened here? I think that's quite useful, because I think we are facing so much uncertainty, and there's so many different ways that we try to grapple with this. I think following the Second World War, there was this idea of progress, and that humanity would all somehow organize ourselves for the better. I think there was a firm belief in liberal democracy, a firm belief among many that at least some form of capitalism would assist the many rather than the few. So I think with that now undermined and the realization that this is not happening, and to the contrary, and as we would argue that corporate capitalism is one of the major culprits here, this type of organization focusing on continued growth based on energy and fossil fuel expansion is now, there's a realization that this is not going to work. And I think a lot of people at the moment is saying, oh, what now? How can we do things differently, and what are the different ways of looking forward, and how should we organize ourselves?
So
I don't know if
this narrative of progress, of humanism in a sense, also of work, of also doing good in a sense, has been shaken. Is what you're saying, and the belief in future maybe even also has been affected.
I think so. I do think that there's been almost a totalitarian system in the sense that that there was a human future that and coming on from the Enlightenment in many ways, that it's going to get better, and each generation is going to have it slightly better. And I think this is not the only sort of totalitarian image of the future. We saw a completely different one in Russia, in the sense of they had their future that then collapsed. And I'm guessing what the Western capitalist countries is now having their future collapse. And and I think there was a moment of self-gloating in the 80s and the 90s when the communist system crumbled. But I think the Western system is now crumbled, and there is no firm alternative that we can turn to, and that creates a lot of uncertainties.
Yeah. So in a sense, you could also see this as a parallel to 1989, in the sense that what happened behind the East Curtain, and then this narrative of progress of advancing and distributing also wealth and well-being to the entire population, that sort of crushed behind the the Iron Curtain, and then it was taken. This narrative was also sort of taken over and incorporated also within the idea of economy.
Yes, yes, and I think it is a, in many ways, dangerous situation where we now don't have any future narrative that the human or many part of humanity can move behind and see a better future for ourselves, and also for our children or our other species or habitats and communities. And I think this for me is problematic in many ways also because there is now a situation where I guess conservative or even fascist narratives can take hold because of these uncertainties. And I think there's no accident that we are seeing a rise of authoritarian populism in that sense, that they provide a future, although that's a future by looking back to the maybe 1950s, but it's still a future that people can feel secure in. People recognize there are boundaries and divisions. Human beings are in control, and we are the masters of the universe. And so I think this counter narrative is very dangerous, and I think it's important for us then as scholars to find other narratives that humans can buy into, that is perhaps a bit more peaceful and progressive.
So what you're talking about is also the closure of the future in a sense. And if one looks around for the time being, there's also sort of a sort of pre-traumatic syndrome that we are affected by. We actually does some mourning even before the fact, that because of this closure of the future, and then there's also response to this in a number of ways, sort of a reactionary response to that, and people suggesting solutions and ways out, since we are affected by, or maybe also to some extent affected by this closure of the future.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, theoretically, the future has always been closed. For me, it's also about which past is it that direct the future. So the idea of progress have a particular past, a very linear past that a lot of Western countries have bought into. But if you look at different pasts, they have not been as linear. They're not been as progressive. So I think there's this idea of future, and it has always been closed. The point is to which history to see the future through. And at the moment, we seem to see the future through history of the 1950s and the strong man, and I use the gender purposefully here, that we look to for solutions. And I think that is dangerous.
Yeah, it's also the narrative of civilization, isn't it? It's in a sense also the narrative of colonialism and a certain approach to the world, of mastering the world, that has sort of spread with colonialism also in a sense from Europe and to the rest of the world. And it is that kind of narrative perspective that's now being debunked by a wider context appearing.
Yeah, and I do think we cannot separate the fossil fuel expansion and corporate capitalism from its colonial history. I think we need to look to the colonial history and the effect of capitalism on other species and human beings in order to see an alternative future. I think recognizing the violence is a necessary part to imagine an alternative future.
And in that context, also various narratives become very important, I think, also according to you. And you depict various narratives also in the introduction that we talked upon to this organization issue of organization, which is also various scenarios. I think you described in this article. Could you talk a bit more?
Absolutely. So in the article, or in the introduction really to this special issue, we are discussing 5 different narratives of the Anthropocene that we depicted at that time, and they're obviously overlapping, and they are existing simultaneously, and some groups people will recognize themselves in several of these. But the most, I think, the most common one is sort of that sort of the business as usual, where we assume that economics and markets will sort it out. It's quite linear narrative that we will continue as we are with small tweaks. So we continue consuming as we are, but instead we might buy a green beer or organic T-shirts, and then, but with that we can then how our present in the future.
Yeah, you call that business as usual.
Yeah, business as usual, and. We also in this narrative seem to look to the state to having a small corrective role in making sure that the protest and the disruption is not too bad.
Would the science of economics and also the idea of economy be part of that narrative?
Absolutely. I think economics has been the major organizing principle since the 1980s. That we are seeing that, when I grew up, we saw the business news coming up straight after the normal news, and we now see in most papers that the financial news taking as large part as any other aspect of the news. So we're seeing economics as an organizing principle, perhaps more above and beyond societal principles around other values than economic values.
So I think. Sorry.
Yeah.
Continue,
no.
please.
I think you're absolutely right in that. There is an organization around economics and economic value.
Yeah, and it would also be part of this narrative, wouldn't it, of the Enlightenment, progress, and distribution of wealth and well-being, in a sense. It's part sort of quite closely related to that approach.
Absolutely. And this distribution is then dependent on economic calculations. So your worth is in monetary terms. Your identification is in monetary terms, and so on. So that's sort of the first one. I don't know if we have space to go through them all.
But, please go ahead.
But so that's I think is the sort of what we are. There's the major narrative at the moment, and then we have also others, sort of the more eco-modernist or the technological narrative that feed into the idea that with this is actually quite a good thing, that there's an opportunity for new technological innovations and amazing new ways of living and acting in this new era, where basically can decouple corporate capitalism from the environment, and we will see human ingenuity saving the day. So that's a second narrative. We focus on technology rather than economics. And then we can then see this geoengineering taking place to create a better world rather than just a good world. So with this, there is an opportunity to create the world we really should have rather than perhaps the one we were given as human species.
Is this still a focus on human ingenuity? Or
absolutely. I don't see anyone in the eco-modernist literature paying much attention to obviously there's this biological mimicry where they talk about we could copy the biological creatures. We can look at spiders and that will help us understand certain things about buildings. So of course there's but it's still based on human translation and ingenuity that's capturing these biological processes that might have been hidden for us before. So I don't see there's not much value for nature beyond serving human beings still in that sense.
So in that sense, you see still in this narrative, you see humans and humanity as the sort of the core value.
Absolutely, and humans are in control here. Yeah. So this is just this is an opportunity to change for the better. They recognize a break here, perhaps more than the first narrative, but they still very much a human narrative. And I think this is then the third then we would discuss is sort of the more organizing resistance, that recognizing there are a lot of different narratives in society obvious in the last few years to Extinction Rebellion or school strikes for future. So by organized and as a by school children across the world, and it's been fantastic to see that there is this recognition of that this is highly problematic, and we are facing a radical situation that requires a radical transformation of society and how we lead our lives. And these narratives, we see more ideas around social justice. And also, I think here we recognize that the necessary hindering of further fossil fuel extraction and production and consumption. So I think this is organized resistance here. There's a broad social movements across different countries, but also internationally in terms of, for example, there's now a relatively successful divestment movement. But also here we see really interesting, quite recent legal cases where we are seeing people suing corporates, but so in terms of taking action for the environment, but also in a more positive sense, providing legal rights to the environment. We've seen that in a few countries now where activists using legal frameworks to protect the environment. Because I think in the most corporate most capitalist democracies, we've seen a reduction of environmental protections over the last 20 years. So they try to take that back again.
So this described as organizing resistance. So you describe it in this way. This is this scenario. Yes. Yeah.
So that's another way to look at it. We have there's a lot of mobilization that we I think we need to pay attention to and support as scholars considering the situation we're in. And then there is aligned with this also the alternative organizing alternatives, where we try to look at new forms of social organization, recognize that corporate capitalism perhaps doesn't work. How can we do it otherwise? So here we point out things like the community-owned renewable energy or food corporations, and we see now even certain countries taking up the idea of circular economy, even though I might not be a firm believer in that, but I think alternatives is necessary, and any discussion is useful in that sense. I don't think that would be a system replacement. So I think we need a lot of different forms of organizing, trying them out, what's work, what doesn't work, what work in what context, in what industries, and so on. So that I think it's also we're seeing organizing alternatives to corporate capitalism. And then the final one is sort of organizing culture. And I do think we are seeing a lot of literature, art, movies that are coming out that help us imagining how the effects and consequences of the Anthropocene. And I think paying attention to that is useful. And in many ways, only art can save us, in the sense only art has the possibility to really challenge human understanding of things, where most other aspects of our lives are so institutionalized that is art often turned to see things completely different, have different emotions and so on. And I think art in that has a tremendous role to help us imagine alternatives. So those
and why turn specifically to art? Of course, there's this certain specific position of art questioning, but would there be other reasons for expecting that of art?
Oh, I'm not expecting. I'm more hoping. I guess. I do think. I mean, I've been to quite a few exhibitions around climate change, and and it is obvious that even very good artists is struggling with Anthropocene and climate change and grapple with it. The reason I think we might have to turn to art is that they normally have their place outside institutionalized society. They have the place to criticize and provide alternatives, and that has their role. And I think we as academics have also that role, but our critique has all normally been negative, in the sense we haven't provided so much alternative images, emotions, ideas, as in is being much more surely it's an affirmative critique in that you're saying not this, but we haven't been really good at building alternatives in academia, I think, compared to arts.
Yeah, so that would also be that we should be on the lookout for developing alternative forms of critique, maybe not only negative critique, but also affirmative critique, and maybe also art could be a way of developing that. I'm also asking because it to a certain extent, what you're saying now would also correspond with the conference that I mentioned not so long ago that Martha is organizing at the British Academy on aestheticizing the Anthropocene, because that's also what can be done with art, isn't it?
Yeah, I was hoping that would be a switch to you,
Martha.
I feel I've been taking too much of a space here, so I was hoping Martha would go, yes, and.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I agree with that. And especially aesthetic, I think it can help reflecting on how we deal with everyday issues, everyday problems, and how to inquire the moral, political, and social and environmental ramifications of our actions. So this is why, like the conference has these themes. Also, I think that art and aesthetic reflections help to reflect on the decision-making process and the governance and how we are living on the earth and making decisions and consume and produce on the everyday life. And the Anthropocene is a very difficult concept, and it's very challenging to understand its complexity and its entirety. So art I completely agree, can help give a glimpse on what are the effects that we are having on the Earth system, but also what might be potential futures, potential scenarios, and potential alternatives, because it's quite clear that the way that we have been acting, the way that we have taken decisions, the business as usual, they are not really effective at the moment. So we need radical new solutions. We need to change the way that we are thinking and acting and rationalizing also business and decision making. And this can happen through art or through, like also in the paper of Amle, we suggest that it can be through radical new imaginary solutions and try to completely challenge the way that the system works at the moment. So our propositions, because it's not been concretely done, and also we have seen in my previous business school when we proposed to do something different, that has not been welcomed and been accepted, because what is important is the business as usual is profit making and it's constant. And that is also what is for me problematic. I was associate professor in innovation, and innovation is highly problematic because in its theories and its way of execution, it's first of all you need to define a strategy in order to constantly increase firms' competitiveness, as if the resources were infinite. You need to maximize portfolio value. You need to increase innovation efficiency and speed to produce more, produce faster, produce cheaper. And instead of extending the life cycle of goods and trying to produce things that are durable, that can be recycled or can give, and can also develop mutualistic approaches to production. So giving back the energy, giving back the material that is taken. They are the current business model are all focused on producing more and producing faster. And this is also one of the problems, for example, with the fast fashion model that has been quite celebrated in innovation theories, and that they not look at all the consequences that they had, both on climate change, biodiversity loss, also the natural resources degradations, and ethical issues. So we know that especially with the global corporations, that they have celebrated globalizations as a win-win situation, whereby they were transferring their production line into developing countries, saying that we're going to create opportunities for those regions, but there was just an exploitation of both natural resources and human labor.
This is also what we're experiencing now, the flip side of globalization, in a very accentuated way, both with regards to social effects, but also with the effects on the earth and more globally, I think, in general. But there might also be this specific characteristic of art, that it has this experimental, this explorative approach and imaginative approach to the world, and from a situated perspective, I think, and that might also be why we sometimes turn to art for the exploration of alternatives. But it can also be a characteristic of some research, can't it? That one tries to explore, and one remains curious, and one tries to go to places where one haven't been and try to examine what's going on here. Mm. So at some point there might be an affinity between the autonomy of art and the autonomy of research in that regard. But as you said, often it's not. It can also be the other way around with this, for example, the usual approach to innovation.
Yes, absolutely, and the way that I've been working with art or exploring the art of possibilities is both dual. So one, it's first understanding how the art understands climate change and the Anthropocene, but also working with artists in sort of action research and trying to co-create artistic forms that would help present the issues. So, for example, with
so this is a collaboration in a sense between science and art, isn't it? And that trying to create new kinds of
It's like you have seen it at Leicester when Bruno Latour came to the inaugural lecture. Claire Driscoll with Jan Zalazewski, they have created the square meter, the Anthropocene square meter. That was a square meter where in each layer there was a representation of what is the Anthropocene. So it was an artistic both explanation and inquiry of how we can represent the earth and make it intelligible to also the audience. And through that, we started a discussion.
Yeah, so this was a work of art created in collaboration between an earth scientist or geologist on one hand and then an artist on the other hand. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that really helped. What was very interesting, both the art process, because I was involved in the artistic process, how the artist understands science, how they represent and how they translate it into the artistic form, and then also see the reactions of the audience to this piece of art. That was very interesting. How it was received. What were the questions that emerged during the interaction? What it means to touch the Anthropocene in that way. Yeah,
yeah. Now, I also wanted to discuss your article, Marta, the business school in the Anthropocene. And you're right, we have entered the Anthropocene, new geological epoch in which human activities and led by business interests have compromised the Earth system. Why this specific edition led by business interests, and what does that mean?
Yes, so we have, as you have discussed with Mark and Jan, we created this interdisciplinary research group because they came to realize that most of the political, economic decision-making are made by business. And so if we want to make a change, we need to work and interact with businesses. The problem that we are experiencing is that there is this profound crisis of communication that is not only disciplinary, because it's very difficult to explain the scientific discoveries into a business setting, but also it's epistemological and it's generalized between different forms of knowledge, practice, and between different interest groups. So everyone having their own argument, and they are trying to bring forward their perspective. And the businesses are interested in the net present value, what is happening now. They think that the resources are infinite and that ceteris paribus conditions, like if they can maximize the profit nowadays, they're going to do it regardless what is going to happen in the future. So what we wanted to, like our initial aim was to start to have a different conversation, trying to bring into the conversation also the non-human actors and the nature, the earth system that is systematically left aside of the business discourse.
Yeah.
So this is why we suggested that there is this crisis in the communication, and the ways that businesses are approaching communication is quite parasitic, in the sense that the way that we are living, producing, consuming, we are using as many resources as possible. And this means to be a very bad parasite, because afterwards we are not going to have anything left to live on. So it's quite a dangerous game.
Yeah, but this also links up with what we discussed with Daniel little shortly before, I think, because there's this lack of communication, as you describe it, which can also be described as a sort of desensitization, can't it? It's this: we have the information, we actually sense that something is going on, and then we still arrive at pretending as if and continuing business as usual. And why is that? That's also an interesting problem, isn't it? That there is this sort of decoupling, in a sense. What are the reasons for this? If we have the information, then, and if we know that this is shitty and that the future is bleak, why do we continue as we used to be?
Yeah,
we can both respond to that, of course. I would like to know the answer.
We have discussed this in our group, and what we came about to discuss was that it's a problem of time and freezing time. So organizations are, as Daniel was mentioning before, they cannot really realize the future. They are stuck, they are frozen in this present moment. That is what counts, and shareholders' values is much more important than stakeholder values. So what might be helpful is to change the temporal perspective, try to understand, like the way that business is taught, constructed, and also practice is to have a quite short-term perspective, 5-10 years. But what is going to happen in 1 million years? What is going to happen like in 100 years? That is not factored inside organizations. So time is not an important factor, and therefore all decision making is just in the present, and this might cause some of the.
So this is a short-sighted perspective, you're saying, and one should then take the longer perspective, and this might also link up with economics, because that's also what economics describe is the short-sighted action of taking into account mainly sort of the self-interest of the actor. So that it also, this perspective focus on the near future. Of course, it would also claim that because you cannot know, or you cannot sort of get the entire picture if you take the longer perspective. But what you're saying is that one should also adopt the longer perspective. And what would be the virtues of doing that?
Well,
for example, what it's doing also with the Anthropocene is also adopting the long geological perspective, isn't it?
Yeah. So we were suggesting, for example, like one of the
is called geohistory, in a sense. Yeah, exactly. One should move from history to geohistory. Yeah.
Exactly, to insert that also in the business curriculum, the business thinking, and also try to come up with what might be perceived as the irrational solution, like trying to think about new imaginary solutions to that, because it's very difficult to imagine the future, but then has to be brought into the business reasoning, because and to think about organization as soft rather than hard structures. So in that way,
but it also enables you to sort of move away from the human-centered perspective towards a more broadly centered or broadly organized perspectives, and I think that's also what's interesting about geology. We're just only this very small part of a very large history that will continue, and will of course also continue after we were no longer there. Jan Salsius has written a book about the Earth after us, and where he imagines Martians arriving to the Earth, and then they would be able to sort of dig out certain remains and then tell us something about ourselves. But this would be from a non-human centered perspective, in a sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that is
But it also seems that what we're facing here is a complex problem. It's the problem of human exceptionalism and what Latour also would term the modern constitution, this idea of a basic divide and gulf between human beings and other beings, this anthropocentric approach. That I think that's also what makes us become insensitive to what's going on, that we remain so embedded in ourselves, and that's sort of built into our way of responding, I think. And this idea, as you also mentioned, of communication, of this as to pass on information and then respond to information that's passed on, is also a reductive approach to information.
Exactly, and also the idea that communication is just about information is really undermined. Like listening to the Earth system. So one of the things we are constantly failing is to understand what are the needs of the Earth system and how to address them. And what is also the leadership style of the Earth system, where we are all embedded, both humans, but also the biosphere, the lithosphere, the different spheres. And one scary thing that we have seen is that there is a extreme dominance of the technosphere at this moment. It is one of the concepts Peter Huff were right there. That is Mark and Jan have also weighted it in one of their papers. It's extremely heavy, extremely present, and it's all the infrastructure that is around us. So that is privileged compared to the non-human living actors. Which we need to instead include in our communication, both in terms of listening and talk with them, and bring into the conversation.
Yeah, and why is it that rationality is not enough? Because one could also claim that we can, if you take a rational perspective, this is not going to last. But why is it that it doesn't make us move? Could it also be that rationality is part of this approach? It's sort of this idea of taking a survey of the world, of being on top of the world, and then acting from this position of power over and not power through. So it might also be that this perspective is actually inherently built into our idea of rationality. Kant would certainly already have been aware of that. I think rationality, in a sense, is rather primitive. It's sort of a self-assertion. It asserts itself and take this total view of the world, but it's not a situated view.
No, and the problem of the, as Daniel was mentioning, neoliberal doctrine is that the rationality that is widespread is quite Kantian and Enlightenment. Heritage, whereby humans are the center, they are always the focus, and they are the most important actors in the world. So it's a very limited rationality, and if we stay within the same rationality, we are just gonna take incremental changes, and we are on a turning point where we cannot just incrementally change. We need to radically change it. We want the humans to survive. The Earth is going to be there after us, but what are going to be to humans. Do we want to still have humans on the Earth? So that's, we need to imagine completely new solutions, and the problems that if we say within the same neoliberal rationality, it's going to be very hard to imagine something different, and what it might come out is irrational, something that can be perceived irrational. So we need a new rationality that is still rational, still scientific, but new approaches. This is what we were thinking of discussing, because it's a point where we cannot really turn and we cannot move. It's like quite mobile where we are.
In that sense, rationality tends to sort of want to retain control. As they would say in Britain, in the UK, take back control. That's part of the response to this, isn't it? That rationality aims to take back control. That was also part of the business as usual narrative that you mentioned, Daniel, wasn't it?
Yes, and I think Marta is onto something important here, that rationality is something being rational is within certain imaginaries or certain conventions. And any argument against this is then seen as irrational. And unless we change the conventions, the imaginaries, everything we suggest is going to be irrational. I mean, whatever solution you come up with, the current dominant form of thinking makes that seem to be irrational or unrealistic, or you being naive. So because reality is so forcefully instituted by certain organizing principles that really produce what we can say and think in a what is seen as rational way, we need these alternatives to be so strong and that they are taking over, that actually degrowth is rational, or taking habitat into account in making decisions for business is rational. So we need to change the convention so that the argument that is seen as rational is rational within those new alternative conventions.
So in that sense, rationality, the retainment of rationality, is demobilizing in a sense, and has a certain effective confinement. You can say it makes you become confined within the already existent approach.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, any statement is logical in its internal logic, but it's also only logical in the convention in which it is made. And if you don't change those surrounding conventions, we cannot change the logical or the rationality of a statement. So I think that's why it's so important to dare to be, what Marta says, irrational. And we need to forcefully be irrational to change these conventions, to provide more radical solutions that we are providing at the moment. And I think the problem is not that there is no radical solutions, and I think this is a false claim. The problem is that these radical solutions are seen as unrealistic, irrational, and naive.
Marta, you use this term parasitism, or the parasite, from Michel Serres, in order to describe the situation we are actually in. Could you develop that a bit?
Yes. So it's we are using that to describe and to think about how we are behaving as humans towards the Earth system. So Michel Serres has this really interesting distinction between the bad parasite and the good parasite. So the bad parasite is someone that is entering, it's an organism that is entering into another organism and sucking out all the energy, all the life, then killing that. Or it can be like a guest that is uninvited, comes uninvited for dinner, and then is.
But speaking in terms of organization, and it also reorganizes its host, doesn't it? According to Serres, when this. It makes it work in the context in which it enters. Makes it working in a different way, and this interface affects both sides of the relationship.
Yes, and it's when it changes the dynamics and interactions between the host and the guest. So in the sense of the dinner, an invited dinner is when it's, for example, mobilizing the guest against each other. So they are behaving in a different way compared to what he was initially thinking. And he also suggests that the way that we need to think about business and our relation with the environment is that organizations should develop a mutualistic approach towards organizing and innovation. And that means that they need to think with each other. They need to think about mutualistic ways. They need to think about how to give back what they take. So one of the examples that we are bringing forward, for example, is slow design. And this is an emerging practice in design whereby the designers are working with the local heritage, trying to understand how to make things naturally, how to encourage life within the biosphere. As I said before, the practices of fast fashion and design as extinguished as cause mass extinctions and biosphere loss. If we think about the cotton, the RLC disaster that was to support the cotton industry.
But what if we stay a bit with this image that you use of humans as a large parasite on the Earth system? Where would that take us?
Well, if we are not becoming mutualistic, we are gonna basically suck out every single resource of the Earth system, and then left with nothing.
What happens to the parasite if it destroys its host?
Well, either it migrates somewhere else, another organism, and one alternative is for us to go into another planet once the intergalactic travels be allowed.
And people are already imagining that solution, aren't they?
Yeah. Or even like in our astronomy department, they are looking at satellites to capture the satellites in order to extract minerals. So that it's a reality that is happening, how to get resources from the outspace, because we have consumed, and as a parasites we have started to use almost everything that it's available. So either we become mutualistic and start to give back, or we're not going to see a future.
So parasitism can take various forms. It takes this where you suck out the host and then leave it behind. But you can also develop a sort of more mutualistic approach where you give back something to the host. It also happens with for example, the relationship between fungi and trees.
And that is a way that they have learned to de-escalate the violence that is in parasitism into a more mutualistic approach, because the parasitic relation is quite violent, whereas the fungi and the trees it's more mutualistic, is more relational rather than authoritarian and violent.
And one could also say that humankind has become a major and overarching parasite, if that's not a contradiction in adjective, and needs to sort of face up to that. That's a problem, that we actually become, that the parasite has begun to acquire the size of the host.
And what we need to learn is, in that context, to find more mutualistic way to coexist and to intensify the cycles, like to disintensify the cycles of exclusion and parasitism, and to try to find more creative, ethical ways to bring forward sustainable path. Because the parasitism can be quite violent, and also it has only one univocal way of agency, whereas being a mutualistic parasite means to have a multidimensional understanding of agency. So this is one way also forward that we can think about being mutual parasites rather than violent parasites.
So we should be a more wise parasite in a sense, or what would be the way ahead?
Trying to start to think with rather than against the Earth system, and because at the moment the agency is only human agency. It's about the way that us, or the businesses and the humans are quite, in a way, they are quite fetished towards the resources, and they are really acting in a way irrational, because it's against the self-interest of the human species to continue like this. But the irrationality is so embedded into this rational economic way of working that is very hard to see beyond, and thinking with rather than against.
When describing humans as parasite, you also make me think of Lynn Margulis, who says that we imagine human beings as being the most highly evolved species on Earth, but it's a bit like Freud's ego. It's a fool, it's a buffoon that's imagining itself to be at the center of the universe, and at the very same time, it's, from another perspective, it's just a small latter-day minor permutation in the ongoing evolution of the smallest and most ancient and maybe most versatile and most imaginative part of the earth, namely bacteria, in a sense. And maybe one should begin imagining ourselves as or perceiving ourselves as a parasite, and maybe as a minor parasite, and that needs to fit into a larger perspective. What would be the way ahead? You already touched upon that, both of you. What could one do other ways? Could one imagine new ways of relating to the universe, new ways of value creation, new ways of organizing?
Well, perhaps one way could be like an immediate one could be to slow down this parasitism. So slowing down, it's might be an approach. Maybe degrowth has been perceived as problematic by businesses, but nothing should prevent from slowing down. It's not that we need an infinite growth or maximization of the profit. So we need to do to slow down this process and to try to open up. Also,
and what does that mean? In a sense, it's slowing down. In another sense, it's not that simple, is it? When you describe this process of slowing down, of slow design, slow production.
No, it's not simple, and it's quite ethical. And
it's not just getting lazy. It's more than that.
It's much more than that. It's not also. It doesn't really means to make things slow, like the production line slower. But what it means is taking the time to do the things and respect the time of nature. So not force the growth of the natural resources, not force the extraction of the natural resources, but respecting the cycle of nature, respecting the time that, for example, cotton needs to grow rather than bomb it with pesticides. So trying to find also these mutualistic ways with the local biosphere, the local biodiversity to support, sustain without too many poisonous approaches. And then in the production system, like to not produce as much as possible, but produce what is needed. And with integrating in this also ways to give back. So for example, what to do with the object once you don't need anymore. Do you dispose? Do you trash it? What do you do with that? Can you give it back to nature?
I believe both of you used the term or syntagma organizing with rather than against. Would that be a way of describing what one's looking for?
I think so. And I mean, part of the major forms of organizing today, corporate capitalism, is really about competition. And it's competition about extraction as fast as possible. So I am doubtful that current form of dominant form of organizing can slow down, because that defeats the purpose of expansion and growth that capitalism is built upon. Now I don't think it's possible to turn off capitalism overnight, but I do think we need immediately highlighting new forms of sustainable forms of organizing that is going on. That is where we talk about sufficiency rather than maximizing. So take as much as the earth allows us to, rather than as much as you can for a short period of time. And I do think there are agricultural movement around this where we start thinking that this movement start thinking about what is enough for us to sustain ourselves. But with that, we also need to obviously to have other principles of identification and value. We cannot any longer identify ourselves with what we buy and consume. We cannot have the value of economics or market value as the main organizing principle. We need to start thinking about other values around justice and so on. So I think it's obviously a big task ahead, but there is no alternative. In that sense, you have to be optimistic, because even a slightly worse is worth fighting for comparatively to extinction of everything, of human beings. So I think we use the term hope without optimism, in the sense that we have to understand that things can get worse, but they can become more or less worse. So in that sense, we should not believe, as especially from perhaps a Western position that's used to the idea of progress, that things will get better. They will get worse, but there is still degrees in hell in that sense. And we need to start thinking about what are we willing to give up. Which travels are we willing to give up? Which fashions are we willing to give up? Which food sources are we willing to give up? And that doesn't necessarily mean we're going to have a worse life. It's going to be a life not dependent on our worth in economic terms.
Yeah. In that sense, also maybe less self-assertion. We have more consideration. Also as part of the way we organize. This was built into the way we organize. Maybe towards the end, also in continuance with what you just mentioned, what do you fear? What are your fears? What are your worst fears, if one should? Where might this take us? Because we started also about various scenarios depicted by you, but there's also a relationship between the various scenarios of very narrative, and which way do you think we are going to take if you were to evaluate that? Maybe it's too big a question, and a question that one shouldn't ask. But
yes, especially since it seems to me that we are establishing harder borders. We are being less friendly to people and environments that we're not aware of. I think what we are seeing is more borders, more nationalistic protections, more nationalism, more authoritarianism because of the insecurities. And what we need is the exact opposite, the sense of more friendships, more learning to live with each other and live with other type of habitats and live with other types of species and beings. So unfortunately, what we're seeing is the opposite. I think what a parasite should learn from here. We are drawing up the borders, I think, and it's also problematic because the national sovereignty suggests that this is something that will lead to human suffering in terms of wars over scarce resources, water wars. We might also see wars over shifting the climate in certain circumstances. So while I'm not particularly optimistic, I do think what we are doing is important in the sense of trying to show alternatives to this.
So you ask with both questions I'm going to put, what do you fear and what do you hope? So I think would you have the same fears and the same hopes, Marta?
Yeah, I think as Daniel was mentioning, what I really fear, like on a general level, is this rise of fascisms that we can see both in the political discourses, but also among the population. So that is that is very scary, and it's supporting an ideology that is quite worrying. And then on the, especially in the UK, it has been really frightening to see how also the education is changing. So it's, for example, in my previous institution, where whilst we had these, for example, exciting masters that were looking at alternatives, and we tried to embed in the teaching the research that we were doing and trying to stimulate critical thinking in the students and trying to bring them into questioning mainstream management. That has almost overnight changed. And my colleagues that are been conducting critical management and sustainability research have been made redundant. I mean, it's really frightening.
There's a parallel actually at Copenhagen Business School right now, because there's an educational program that's been announced recently on the education of alternative forms of capitalism, alternative forms of value production, and students are enrolling for that. But at the very same time, there's been heavy criticism of that for being non-scientific, irrational, activistic, and what would your comments be on this? Because that's also what we started out by discussing, that there's also, or that you described, Daniel, this counter-mobilization when you begin discussing these issues, that there are certain people that would certainly do a lot to try to avoid that.
Yeah, I think this is that false sense, the false production of that there is a neutral position on this. That the status quo is the neutral and scientific reality. So any critique then is activism, but any lecturer who is reinforcing corporate capitalism, reinforcing self-interest, reinforcing short-termism is not an activist. But if you question this, you are an activist. And that says a lot about the current major organizing principle and the production of the institutions and also the challenge of the task ahead, I guess.
Yeah. This is sort of a reenactment of the positivism stride, in the sense that this is a positivistic idea of science, of science is reconfirming what is actually the case, and then imagining that this is a neutral position. Now we discussed what you feel, what you hope are the things you would like to imagine as a sort of in between.
Yes,
maybe both as a larger or at a minor scale.
I think I've been brought to tears several times by the school strikes, and I think that's why in previous perhaps somewhat revolutions we have seen university students, but with universities now being so institutionalized, maybe the revolution is not coming from university students even, maybe they're coming from high school students. And I think it's that we haven't seen the same movement on university campuses is amazing. In the sense of the university is part of the institution that is producing business interest and capitalism in that sense.
So you could imagine that happening.
So I mean, what I'm hoping is that this type of strikes and high school activism can continue, and actually starting then to enroll in and asking for different courses, different institutions, different types of work. And I think that's the hope. I mean, it's completely unfair to put any responsibilities on these kids, but on the same time, it's the only hope. And I think we saw a little bit of that after the financial crash in 2008, when the big universities were continuing teaching mainstream economics, and it was the students who asked for alternative courses of economics, realizing, look, this didn't work. Why are you still teaching us this? It wasn't the lecturers, it wasn't the professors who have to, produce within the institutions. It was the university students. And just as a hope, there will be questioning of our institution and reckoning of our institution that we are forced to provide alternative ideas.
So you'd imagine people coming and just pinpointing this doesn't work. We need to look for other alternatives, also what Marta would call the pataphysical reasoning. Are there things you'd like to imagine, Marta?
Well, before that, you mentioned that the students are enrolled in these alternative courses at CBS. That is already something that makes me hopeful. And despite might have received the criticism, at least the course is running and the students are demonstrating interest. So that is really nice to know. And there might be alternative futures thanks to that. And also, it's quite interesting that Denmark has decided to disinvest from fossil fuel. So that it makes me hopeful of the future.
Denmark has stopped the extraction of fossil fuel from North Sea. Have you any idea what might become of man, humankind, human beings as an extension of what we discussed? Have we begun, or should we begin reconceiving ourselves, our role, and what we're asking here towards the end is actually Kant's 4 questions, but in a different way.
I mean, there's no doubt that human beings need to see themselves differently, and with that, I'm mostly referring to Western and Western ways of looking at it, because I think we have seen in different periods of time where civilized organization has looked upon themselves differently. I'm not an expert, but there are several indigenous ways of looking at their relationship to the planet that is not as separate and not as domineering. And while I don't want to romanticize these kind of ideas, I think there are different ways of seeing yourself as a human being in relation to both other people and the planet.
And this would also entail looking at the planet and at other beings in a different way, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, and similarly to that, I think with my colleagues from the Anthropocene research group, and in particularly in the work led by Martin Quinn, we have been starting to rethink what it means to be humans in the city, and especially after the pandemic, what it means to live in a city, how the cities have changed because they have been reshaped by the pandemic, the lockdowns, and we have seen, for example, the pictures of the fishes and the dolphins in Venice and things that were unimaginable. So that gave us the opportunity to think about how do we relate and what kind of policies would be needed to support, to not go back to the pre-pandemic or to try to learn from this experience that was an announced tragedy that no one really took seriously. Like there were all the signals that the papers on the Anthropocene review, since I think it was 4 years that they were mentioning that we were about to get a pandemic, and the government really didn't prepare for that. So now that we have seen a potential way of living, it's what can we learn and change and think differently also in the way that we live on the daily life and work and travel.
Yeah. Did you watch the Bong Joon-ho movie Parasite? Any of you? Yeah.
Yes.
Could that also be read as some sort of an emblematic for the Anthropocene?
Yeah, no, I do think it holds a lot of value in seeing and imagining our relationship to each other and the planet in that sense. But also something that is important here is to understand the class difference or economic differences. And I think that movie also highlights the problematics in that kind of clear economic divisions and in inequalities and in that. So I think that movie holds a lot of different ways to look at the Anthropocene, and especially considering that we mentioned, that those most successful in extraction and using the current system is now looking for another planet. I mean, it's not an accident that there is the richest people in the world that is looking for an escape route. It's not the poorest. So
and then they can leave problems behind then, hopefully. But you touched upon, maybe one could also shortly touch upon the pandemic, because that's also a parasite, isn't it? We are experiencing, and is this a wise parasite or?
Yeah, well, I think the pandemic is a stark example of how we have changed the Earth system and how nature is answering to that, basically. And it's also a representation of a parasite model, whereby the virus is entering in our body and colonizing it. And at the same time, as a parasite, it's changing because the more we try to resist and produce antibodies and vaccinations, the more it mutates. So it's something that, and the scientist has predicted that, and that is not going to be the first, not the last pandemic that we are going to see. And the ongoing spread of this current mutation, the coronavirus, has also put forward, demonstrated the relations and that are rapidly emerging and changing the relations in the social, but also the economic and the political relations. And it also, especially at the beginning, where the supply chain was interrupted, that I started to question, how do we live in such a world where that is highly interconnected and suddenly we cannot connect anymore, so that there were these delays, and that gives the opportunity to think, should we reconsider the way that we supply food and we create a supply chain?
But one could also claim that nature is, or the earth is responding to our overarching parasitism by parasitism, and that in a sense this is also just a larger a spectre of our own making that then comes back to haunt us and tells us that the world is responding, moving to what we do, and it's responding actively, and that the world in a sense also becomes animated, because this parasite has a certain agency, hasn't it? It responds to what we do, and what we do as human beings do to protect ourselves.
Yeah, I think there is a lot of similar animation and agencies in the extreme weather events we are seeing now,
right.
and how humans respond to that, and we will see more of that in terms of how the Earth system is going to respond to our response to the extreme weather events. We are already now investing billions of dollars in geoengineering that will then the Earth system is going to respond to in an arguably very unpredictable way. So absolutely, we recognize an agency of the Earth that's always been there. But now I guess human beings has to see it in a different way, I think, because of the effects. But it obviously has always been there, and we should have always have listened to it as human beings. But I think it becomes more acute with the extreme volatility of the Earth system.
This is an accentuated loss of control, loss of the cosmological worldview, you can say, too. Also, which is also related to this idea of ourselves. I think, and you also mentioned that man, in the sense of the Anthropocene, is a relatively recent invention, that we had other relationships to the world before that, but one can also wager that man in this sense will be erased like a face in the sand drawn on the edge of the sea, and will be replaced by other ways, other forms of human being. Thank you so much for taking part in this, and it was a great pleasure. And yes, have you got any remarks, or should we end on this note? I think that's fine by me. I think we covered a lot of ground and very interesting examinations. But thank you so much.
Thank you to you and Marta. It was a great pleasure.
Thank you. It was a great conversation.
Bye, and see you soon.
See you soon.
Yeah.